right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we are delighted to welcome back to our little program here, Will Thomas, who has a brand new book called Season of Death. And we have some signed copies available here. I'll go ahead and put a link in the chat comments field. And also, if you have questions for Will, go ahead and put them in. And Barbara will summon me back on screen towards the end of the hour, and I'd be happy to ask any of your questions. Barbara, over to you.
Thank
This
you
is a
very much.
well-oiled routine, by the way.
It really is. I know you did it extremely well. So I am very pleased to see you again, Will. Will actually came to see us last year, but frequently we do this on Zoom. So here we are again, right?
Always have a chance to get out there.
I know. Well, I'm sorry the door should, I'm running interference. I may have to get up and close the door. The dogs find this whole thing to be so exciting. They come and nudge the door open and carry on. So we'll see how we do. Anyway, what a great chance to go back to Victorian London. Interestingly enough, last night we did an event with S.J. Roseanne, who is writing a series, a kind of Holmes Watson series, with a half Chinese partner who she says in the comic world, he's in the comic world and has a wonderful imagination. But it's interesting. Laurie King will have a new book out in June. She's going to premiere it here on June 7th. So, Will, what's the enduring charm of Holmes and Watson?
I was in a restaurant just the other day, a nice Italian restaurant, and I walked in and I was wearing a full suit because we were going to be going to a ballet afterwards. And the guy who ran the restaurant just was so overjoyed to see a guy wearing a suit and tie in his restaurant. I think people enjoy the formal aspect, some part of their life. And just the thought that the beggars walking along with wearing a tie and and a bowler hat or something like that. I think we like that, the formality of it every now and then. Just to step into that world that was so different and so much more formal than what we have here now.
I did read something, I can't remember who wrote it down, but there was a scene, it was a time travel thing where a woman went back to the late Victorian age, and a lot of the book was devoted to just getting her dressed. It was unbelievable what that involved, I mean, like the weight of it, that you couldn't get out of it. She couldn't figure out, how to pee because she couldn't get out of her own way.
Mhm.
You couldn't really get clean if you didn't. So you really had to have help, I guess is the point, if you were wearing clothes like that. Men's maybe less so, but I can certainly understand why maids and valets and so forth were an important part of life for those people who could afford more formal dress.
I definitely agree.
Okay. But I
So
guess
it's just ridiculous to the elaborateness of the outfits, all of the layers, multiple layers until you're ready to actually go out on the street. Um, and then you have to have the right hat, and you have to have the walking stick, and you have to have
right.
the watch chain, everything you need to do to get up and out the door.
I once went to, I love the costume institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They've had some great things over time, but one of them, they had a Victorian mourning clothes museum. I
Mhm.
mean, exhibit, and it was absolutely fascinating. The dictates, going from total black with veils to half black to some gray to lilac, over a period of time. I mean, it was very ritualistic and people didn't want to violate those dress norms and so forth, true, it was a small section of society that, had the money or even cared, but it was remarkable how structured it was and the chivalrous that sort of kept people behaving like that.
Yes, and I also think that when we think about that time, it wasn't just the women that had all these different rules about what they would wear and when. The men's were just as strict, they just weren't as flashy. So you have to worry about ties and which ties you're going to wear and what it means to the people around you.
That's very true. But in the 18th century, the men were actually flashy, maybe even flashier than the women are in Tudor times. So Victorian was a little bit, even the Prince Regent, and it was actually Beau Brummel, I think, who introduced a note of sobriety during the Regency period. And then Prince Alfred was, he's very German and very, very formal. And I think he influenced Victoria in many ways. And it's
Man, I miss those days.
you what?
I missed those days.
Yeah, well, me too. Hello, dog. There you are. I warned everybody you would come creeping in. Anyway, but that's not really the question I was addressing is what is the fascination of having a pair of detectives where one of them is kind of a genius level and the other one is more, he's not ordinary, but he's not, as enigmatic and whatever it is. So he's there to kind of interpret what's happening for us.
Originally, back in 2000, I came up with this idea that I wanted to have a 20-book series that started out with a guy's first day as a private detective, and then, years later, his first day having his own agency. And that was the original thought that I had for that. And in each book, he's growing and changing and evolving, and that was part of the fun of it. So he starts out at the beginning, he doesn't even want to be a detective, and by the end of it, he could not think of any other job he would want to have.
So which one are you talking about, Barker or Llewellyn?
That's Llewellyn.
Okay. But Barker all along, I mean, Barker's a really fascinating person. I did a review which sent out to all of our sorry, I have to start my phone up again here. There we go. Cyrus Barker's shady past and outposts of the British Empire and the skills and wealth he accumulated allow him as a Victorian private inquiry agent to plumb the many cultures, classes, and races of late Victorian London. And I think that you did set up Barker as being wealthy, which is a big help if you're going to be in a profession that, has chancy pay and no benefits. And B, a wide range of experience so that, and language skills and so forth. So he can penetrate various levels of society. Because if he were just like Lord Peter, it would be less possible for him to do so. And particularly in this book, where he has some really, you have criminals and also very high ranking people as objects of his scrutiny.
Yeah, when I first thought of Barker, I really wanted him to have that ability to go as low as necessary and as high as necessary to do his job. And quite frequently, he has to do both, from one to the other, throughout the investigation. He's got to go to the East End or the West End or both at the same, one right after the other.
Absolutely true. But, remembering that late Victorian London was the financial capital and in many ways sort of the capital of the world because of the British Empire, his language skills are helpful too, although are they limited really to Chinese or does he speak other things as well? I can't remember.
Chinese, Japanese, a little French and English and Scottish and probably Gaelic.
Okay. Where it's going to be helpful to have language skills beyond regular English. And sorry, my internet connection, it says here, is unstable. We're having a new roof put on our house. And it has definitely had some effects. So I'm sorry if I fade, just keep going. So I like that about Barker, that he has that ability to not only go high and go low, but also communicate with people. That can prove to be helpful in his investigations.
Yes, I definitely feel that way.
So Thomas Llewellyn, he's Welsh. Why did you make him Welsh?
Well, in my family, I have a Welsh background on one side and a Scottish background on the other. So I had to have a Scotsman and a Welshman. And it is fun for me when I'm writing the books to always have somebody mention the English and Llewellyn's always, no, I'm Welsh. And they're outsiders. It makes them outsiders automatically. and outsiders in society, outsiders in an English world. And that's like a poke right there to make the audience reading it to say, he's not actually English, he's Welsh.
Wait, was he speaking Welsh at all? I mean, because Welsh is
No,
different.
and yeah, it's
Sorry, I
very
was just
different.
going to say that Welsh is, it's what is it? Cymric, I guess it's called. But anyway, it's a different language than Scottish Gaelic for sure.
Right. And of course it's pronounced Llewellyn actually over in
Is it?
Wales. Mhm.
Okay. So Thomas has a interesting history of his own. He went to Oxford and then
Yes,
somehow or other got himself into a mess and wound up in prison, where he had a
Oxford
really,
Prison.
sorry?
Oxford Prison. Oxford University to Oxford Prison in one semester.
That's so cruel of you. Why did you do that to him?
I had a little old lady one time come up to me during a talk, and she rapped me on the chest and says, "You are so mean to that boy." And I'm like, "Yes, I am. I love it."
Well, anyway, that proves useful in this particular book without going into why, but the fact that Thomas has served time in prison makes it possible for him to try at least to connect with somebody later in the book. So his past history is a good one. But anyway, finding regular employment when he came out of prison wasn't that easy. So, having Barker take him on and create a life for him, pay him something was a good thing.
Yes. When I started working on the first book, I've been a Sherlock Holmes fan for all these years and certainly enjoyed the Holmes character, but I was not really interested in writing a pastiche. And the one aggravation I often have is Watson. He's so staid. He's just there as a mouthpiece. And so when I created Llewellyn, he was just all over there. He's interested in himself. He's interested in finding out various things. He's interested in girls. He's interested in everything all at once. And he's morose and everything like that. So when you're normally supposed to be, concentrating on Barker, he's the main detective and all that other stuff, you always get over in this corner. You have Llewellyn just being Llewellyn. And that's the fun I have for writing.
And then, of course, he becomes further an outsider by marrying Rachel, who is Jewish, which, so both of them don't really fit into normal slots. But I think that's really another aspect of, I mean, England has not always been kind to its Jews. I mean, they were expelled by Edward I in 12 something or other, and finally came back. When was it? Was it under the Tudors? I can't remember, but anyway, they eventually made their way back to England. And during Victorian times, things were loosening up a bit. They had lots of banking, empires coming over from the continent, and Edward VIII, or seventh, who was a man to kind of transcend royal norms and dive into other layers of society. And he was at least recognized a number of wealthy Jewish citizens and
Mhm.
hung out with them, right? Because he always needed money. Maybe that was part of the reason.
Yeah, I think that was interesting. When I first created the characters, it took me maybe a year to finally find a subject that I wanted to write about. And it was a book I had called London's East End, Point of Arrival, which was about the Jews coming coming into England from Russia and Poland and areas like that. And once I read that, just got into it 4 or 5 pages, I like, this is it, finally. It's something I wanted to talk about.
Sure. Well, I mean, yeah, some of them were poor and refugees, and some of them came over from, particularly, I think, Germany, the Rothschilds, and some of those really wealthy families. I've always thought it was an interesting mix, but the fact that England was Protestant for so long, I think made it easier for many. They were more, well, English are not what I call tolerant. Let me rephrase it.
Right.
But it was easier for Jews, I think, to settle in England and do something than it might have been in some of the continental Catholic countries.
Mhm. When the Jews were first kicked out, early, they, they had, the English had gotten so many, bills, from borrowing money from them that it was a lot easier to kick them all out and not have to pay back all those bills that they had accrued.
Yeah, no, absolutely so. Anyway, I'm going to read a paragraph from a really rave review that a mystery reviewer called Tom Nolan, who's got a long and respectable history here doing that kind of thing. And here's what he wrote. As Thomas Llewellyn, who narrates these adventures, notes the complexity of the case, in this case, this one, threatens to humble the confident pair, i.e. Barker and Llewellyn. What cheek we had to assume we could solve any problem with the snap of a finger, says Thomas. Throughout, they remain fascinating figures. The author places them in the context of a larger London, rendered here with cinematic clarity. Man, that's a really terrific compliment. A metropolis of strivers and scoundrels, merchants, mendicants, aristocrats, and toffs. The universe of detective fiction would be a poorer place without the recurring presence of these two stalwart souls in the vibrant world that they move in. Wow, Will.
That was very nice
Indeed.
and unexpected.
Still, I think that Thomas, he actually is a serious fan of people like Ross McDonald and all. I mean, he's very much a fan of more of not hard-boiled detective fiction or traditional detective fiction.
Mhm.
And then, I think it's a real compliment that he actually read a book that's slightly outside his wheelhouse and liked it as much as he did. So this is a book that has two sort of main lines of investigation. Would that be fair to say?
Yes.
Tell us about them.
Okay. Well, first of all, there was I call it a group that you would call maybe like the untouchables of Victorian London. They were called crawlers, and they were beggars, mostly women, who would beg from other beggars. That they had reached that point where, they were going to be passing soon, and they often just sat there, not talking, and the other beggars had the opportunity for like the first time in their lives to actually give alms to somebody else, and they did that. So they would, a beggar would bring his used tea bags and things like that to these people, and they would get hot water from one of the local pubs because the pubs like to give to these people as well. And they would be just barely taken care of because they reached that point normally where had been starving for so long that they could barely even digest, and that's why they had their tea with them. And anyway, it was a art thing I'd never read about. I mean, after 20 years of studying all this stuff, to come across this and go, wow, I need to use this right away. It's just too exciting. And the title Season of Death was used because the season of death for this race of people, I guess you would say, would end between Christmas or December and the spring. So the season of death was this time period starting in December, and most of them wouldn't make it.
You mean because of the cold and
Yes, and the cold and all the deprivations and things like that, not being able to get a lot of the things that were available to them otherwise because the people were not out on the street at that time because it was colder.
oh, I see. So partly the weather and then partly the fact that people were not circulating as much. So I thought it was fascinating that this woman, the crawler, um, has like a little wooden cart or sled or something or other. She can't walk, right? So she
Yeah.
has some way of some locomotion.
No, just basically crawling. That's why they call them crawl. They would, sit somewhere for most of the day, and then usually after the most of the citizenry will have left, they'll be crawling to their next station where they would set up for the next day.
So you're
Normally,
saying they literally crawled along the pavements or whatever?
and usually they were lame in one leg or something like that, and they were not able to stand very much, so they just kind of creep along, at some point. And that's when you've got 1 foot in the grave right there, if you can't even, move about very well.
So, having read about some of the horrible problems that San Francisco has had with its homeless people, and the fact that if nothing else, they use the streets as public toilets, do I
Yes.
assume that, that would have been part of what was going on in these people's lives?
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah.
there was no handy McDonald's to, where they could visit facilities.
Yeah, definitely not. Yeah, that's sort of Victorian into the nitty-gritty of it that they never discuss, and scientists have to figure out, or historians, what they did in this certain situation.
Right. I mean, even getting drink, potable water. I
Right.
mean, cholera was that a continual problem in Victorian London where, the water sources were infected?
Oh, yes, that's why I have Barker, who is a Baptist, occasionally stop in at a pub to have his beer, because the beer was safe to drink, whereas the water wouldn't necessarily be.
That's so interesting. I've explored that over the course of a lifetime of reading historical fiction. And way back, I remember a series that was set in ancient Egypt, right around the first cataract on the Nile. It was a really nifty series, and it was about ordinary people, working people, not the pharaoh and the upper classes. And it pointed out that the Nile water was so unsafe that what they did was they made bread, and then they put bread into the water and waited till it fermented. So they had a rudimentary concept of making, purifying water, so to speak, by creating alcohol so that they could safely drink it. And if you look at the history of what people drank down the ages, you realize that one reason they drank so much alcohol was that it was safe.
All right. I always have fun knocking at least one of my characters into the Thames, which is the most filthy place you could possibly be in the midst of one of my adventures. This one, no exception.
It's amazing they survived. I remember I think it was 2011, we had an opportunity to fly. It was sort of between letting Aung Suu out of prison and the military junta, but there was that like brief year or so where you could go to Myanmar as a tourist reasonably safely. And so we flew from Bangkok to Mandalay, and then we took a wooden kind of a tourist boat from Mandalay down and over to Yangon, which I still call Rangoon. But anyway, the point is that the thing they kept saying to us is don't fall into the river. You can't drink from the river, you can't fall into the river. And at one point, the boat, the river was so shallow in places that the boat would get stuck. And at one point, they actually had to sort of jury rig this really rickety and totally unsafe kind of wooden walkway so we could get off the boat onto shore so that the boat would rise up, because without the passengers, it would be more buoyant. And that was their fear. It was everybody's fear, was that one of us would topple into the river. And your instinct is to open your mouth, right? I mean,
Yes.
it's really hard to fall into the river and keep your mouth closed and not imbibe this water.
And you don't want to think what's in that water.
No.
All
No,
the
they had fountains or they had water sources along the river that the locals use. And the general idea, I guess, is that they were born doing that. And so they had developed immunity to some of the really worst strains of, bad things, bacteria and other stuff in the river. But people like us from first world countries were going to be completely, not recover. And I do think about that. That marked me. So when you dump people into the Thames, I think, oh my God, they've opened their mouths and they probably drunk this disgusting water. And now what?
Yeah, and pretty much as you said, I'm sure the people that worked there every day had that same immunity from having been around it since they were children.
Yeah, well, I've often thought that sailors, drinking water out of barrels that had been on ships for a long time, There must have been some bad stuff in the water too. Maybe they just acclimated to it as they, well, I mean, so, hard for us today where, we turn on a tap and we get fresh water, generally potable, but not always, to realize just how barely safe we are. But we are. Yeah, we don't have any defenses as compared to these people. Anyway, so 2 cases here, one in which involves the crawler and what goes on there.
I mean, as opposed to the other one.
No, tell us more about the crawler.
well,
I mean, she is a
okay.
character, but what's the case that involves her?
She starts out and she is a lookout for a group of thieves called the Dawn Gang that would always arrive at the jeweler's store or whatever it is in the early morning hours. So they were out by dawn, and that was the time when the police have been patrolling all day long, all night long, and they're all exhausted, so they're not going to be paying attention, to a gang of thieves that come in there. And she, the crawler, had one skill, and that was to be able to do bird calls. So she would be informing the robbers with bird calls to say when to leave and to keep them abreast of what's going on. And Barker and Llewellyn are looking for these thieves in the middle of the early morning, and he hears a robin and realizes that robins weren't had already left for the fall at that point. So that's when he figured out that there was somebody out there giving watch, and that's what she was doing there. And so his next thing is to, do I take care of this person? Do I question this person? And she does not want to give him any information, so he has to kind of continually visit her to find out more about her life and what's going on.
So has anybody hired him for this particular job, or is this something he's doing motivated by his own curiosity?
That was more by his own curiosity. He already had a case, or developed a case right at the beginning, and that was from the other side, from the West End, with a wealthy guy who's like running for let's see, he's running to be prime minister. He will eventually be one, and but his sister-in-law has gone missing, and it's very murky as to what exactly happened, because she disappeared on a at a station in the town that they were in, and she couldn't figure out whether she was leaving with a lover and was going to get married, or is she going on her own to escape or whatever. So they've got to figure out that. And one ability that Barker seems to have is the ability to see 2 different things and put them together, and to realize that these 2 different pieces are 2 pieces of the same puzzle.
So the missing sister, is she an heiress?
Yes, she's definitely an heiress, an American heiress, back in those times when was it Jenny Churchill that was?
Yes. Among others, yeah, she was. Consuela Vanderbilt was another. Jenny Churchill certainly was. I think there was a Gould. In other words, there were Americans who had social aspirations that just marrying somebody, with money in New York wasn't going to meet. And there were lots of impoverished aristocrats. The industrial age had made it much more difficult for aristocrats who had vast estates and depended on farming and rents and so forth. All of a sudden, that wasn't working out so well. And so, it was kind of a trade, especially in the case of Consuelo Vanderbilt. She married the Duke of Marlborough, or the heir. I don't remember if he was the Duke at the moment. So she brought the Vanderbilt money in, and he gave her a title in Blenheim Palace, and, and eventually Winston Churchill as a consequence of all that, because the family she married into were the Churchills. They were the Dukes of Marlborough. That was the biggest example. Or was it Jenny Jerome that was Churchill's mother? I think she was, actually. Maybe I'm confusing the 2. But still, Churchill was a Churchill. I'll have to think about that. Anyway, Sorry, I may be conflating Consuela and
No,
Jenny.
it was Jenny Jerome that was in the Churchill family. Yeah.
Yeah, but anyhow, yeah, it was not uncommon. There were quite a lot of marriages between wealthy American daughters and various aristocrats. So this is actually two sisters, right? One
Yes.
who's married to Lord Danvers, and the
Mhm.
other is the one who's gone missing.
Right. She was, I don't want to say an appendage, but she came along with her sister when her sister married simply because she was a, strange girl in a strange land and she needed to have a sister for support since her parents are still living in America.
So they live outside London, the sisters, or Lord Danvers' household, if I remember right. They're sort of a country estate.
Yes, country estate off in southeast, southeast.
Right. Right. So, all right. So we have the crawler and we have the Dawn gang and robberies going on over here. And then we have a missing heiress over here. Um,
Mhm.
and it doesn't look like there's any way for these cases to possibly echo each other. But you knew all along that they might do that.
Oh, yes. And of course, the part of the fun of the stories is having them be knocked around at every one of these different three things that are going on. Shut down, argued with, the silent treatment, as everything you can think of, aside from just being beaten up, basically.
Right.
And so all these different things, are ways to jab at them that make the job not as easy as, could possibly be.
So tell me about their relationship with the police because, they are extrajudicial, Barker and Llewellyn, they are private inquiry agents. So in the end, they can't really arrest people and throw them into prison. So what's their relationship with the constabulary?
That gets a little sticky. Now, in Craig's Court, where their offices were, that's an actual street where all the detectives used to be.
Mhm.
In other words, if you couldn't go to, if you didn't get what you wanted in Scotland Yard, you can go one street over, and there's a list of detectives all in this one row. Most of them are former inspectors from Scotland Yard. They retired and they opened up their own offices, although there were other offices as well by, people that were never part of the Scotland Yard. But the relationship has always been tight. Some inspectors and some, people in charge, commissioners or whatever, were fine with them and others were not. So, occasionally they'll get, they'll be working on the same case together. But, I know this, that the cases that Scotland Yard inspectors had, no case was ever closed until it was completely solved. And each one is carried along. So they may be working on 30 cases.
Right.
And one right after the other. I mean, at the same time, you get a little tidbit from this and you switch over to that case. And so they were constantly busy. So occasionally help from a private investigator would be helpful.
I mean, it's realistic. I mean, you can read Michael Connelly and come to the same realization that no one in the police just works one case. There's a constant inflow of investigations, and many of them are running several at the same time. Investigations don't always proceed in an orderly manner either.
Right. And these two groups don't get along very well. And it's depending on which inspector you talk to, how you're going to be treated and how much your information is going to be used or believed. And so every time they meet, you could be with somebody who really wants to sabotage you, or it could be somebody who wants to steal your stuff, or it's somebody who's actually helpful and wants to help you with your case as opposed to theirs.
Sure. So, I mean, the London police would really like to shut down the Dawn gang.
Right.
You know, I,
Oh,
I thought it was really an interesting juxtaposition of very different cases. You've really gone to some interesting places. I remember one we're on an island. Were we out in the Scillies or somewhere? And one of you, right? And I think that too is one of the nice things about the series, or one of the intriguing things about the series. It's not always just in London, but I try to remember that you can put the entire British Isle in Arizona. I mean, you really can, you know.
Mhm.
And so distances, even if they didn't have modern motor cars and all, maybe, you know, by this time you can go by train practically anywhere in
Right.
Britain. And so you could actually cover a lot of Britain in your cases, realistically. Even in a day, you could go, you know, considerable distances.
And all these train companies were all in competition with each other. So each one wants to get you smoothly out of London, you know, to your destination as quickly as possible, or you're going to choose another train or another direction or something like that.
And they were private railroads. They were, you know, it wasn't like a national system. So they were competing for customers and for all kinds of things. In fact, isn't it a sudden collapse of a railway tunnel in the East End that is part of kills dozens of people and all? Isn't that a part of your story?
Yes, and I'm a train buff, so and I knew that a lot of these companies went bankrupt, which means they would stop at a given moment, and here's this huge tunnel underground, and they just put a sign up, closed forever, and uh, and then they had collapse things, not as big as the one I have, but certainly smaller ones of one sort or another. Tracks, suddenly sinking, and all that mess.
Well, it wasn't standard engineering. Also, you know, that was one way that some of the landed aristocrats made money was that they could lease or sell, mostly lease, I think, their land for canal construction. That's really what got it all going. Because I read, I'm trying to remember what it was, but there was it was leasing land for a canal company. That's how Wedgwood got his China to market.
Really, I had not heard that.
Yeah, he was instrumental in developing the canals because in order to avoid the breakage of, you know, trundling over putting him in wagons and trundling him over the road, he decided that the better money was to help dig the canals, and then you could float your merchandise along. I've been to visit Wedgwood twice, I think. I mean, I've always been fascinated with pottery and China. You know, I've been to Meissen, I've done all that stuff all over Europe. And I really admired Josiah Wedgwood because he was not only an artist and a craftsman, he was a killer businessman. He really was. I've often wondered why somebody doesn't write a series, you know, where around Wedgwood and because all the kinds of things we're talking about figure into his real life. Amazing. Listen, my head down there because I was so annoyed. I looked up. Both Consuelo Vanderbilt and Jenny Jerome married into the Churchill family. Consuelo married the Duke, and Jenny married Lord Randolph, who was not the Duke. So Winston was a Churchill, but he was not in the ducal line. They were cousins. So that obviously the Churchills needed a lot of money. Yeah, they were a Queen Anne. He was the guy that won at Marlborough, and Queen Anne made him a duke. And then his wife, Sarah Churchill, had a famous falling out with Queen Anne. I mean, that's a marvelous. There's some great stories in English history, you know. It's
Yeah.
just anyway. So he built Blenheim, a huge palace, um, and keeping it up. I've been through it twice. It's near Oxford. Actually, it's near Oxford. You could send Thomas to visit Blenheim.
That sounds good.
Yeah, why not? I mean, when I was there the second time, the Duke was there and he joined, you have to go on a tour. You're not just allowed to go in and wander around. And he gave us a tour of some of the family rooms, which are usually shut off because it was a quiet day. And all I could think was that, you know, the cost of, we're replacing the roof on our house, as I earlier mentioned to you. It's a nightmare living underneath it all day, you know, while they're banging and all the rest of it. Blenheim has acres of roof up there. I mean, acres. And just trying to keep up with that alone, you know, would be extraordinary. Diana Spencer's brother, the Earl Spencer, had to
Okay.
sell their Shakespeare folio in order to put a new roof on the family estate. You know, I mean, so these guys really were strapped for money, trying to keep up with stuff.
I'm interested in Randolph Churchill. with dissipated life, running for, um, to be prime minister while at the same
Yeah.
time dying of syphilis. There's
Yeah.
just interesting characters. I mean, that's a world right there that you have dissipated monarchs and dissipated, knights of the realm and things like that. And, that's part of the book as well.
Sure. Well, I mean, there was no cure for a disease like syphilis. We're now about to experience a really broad measles epidemic, which, had been basically wiped out. And then by giving people the right to, say no to vaccines and so forth, the common good, the commonweal, the commonwealth doesn't really exist anymore.
Mhm.
We're in an age of individual freedom, regardless of the damage it does to the general fabric of society or your neighbors.
Mhm. Very
Right.
much.
I know. So, but when you read back historically and you see the terrible things that happened with, cholera, with the plague, whatever it is, and you think, I remember when Salk created his vaccine, nobody thought about not getting it, at least in my community. We all went to school and they lined us all up and they gave us all the vaccine and everybody was rejoicing, because polio was so terrifying.
Mhm.
I sort of wonder what happened to that. Well, that's another question. But in Victorian London, you didn't have that option.
Right. So you could never be sure that you weren't going to catch something.
That's
And
right.
everything that you think was gone will come back, cholera and things like that will come back just when you think it'll never come back.
Sure. Smallpox, all those things. I mean, you were constantly at risk, and women died from having children in all kinds of ways, one of which was puerperal fever. And it wasn't until 1911 or something like that that they figured out that it was in part because the people attending pregnant women didn't bother to wash their hands between patients. And so they could transfer, from one to another. I mean, germs are a 20th century kind of realization, although there was some work done in it. Anyway, I'm sure you can, maybe you'll write a hospital mystery. You feel like, Victorian hospitals, either for the mentally ill or the physically ill, could be a really interesting background.
Barbara, I should be taking notes here.
I'm happy to help plot your books. I really miss my friend Ann Perry. We were friends
Yes.
for a very long time, and she moved to the US and died in Los Angeles towards the end of her life. And she also, I thought, was very good at portraying Thomas Pitt rise through the English policing system through Scotland Yard to a larger role. And yeah, I thought she did a really good job with that. So.
She and I promised to get together, and this took over several years, and then she was suddenly gone, and I was just, so sad about that.
Me too. She left me her earrings, and so I often wear them as a kind of little tribute to her. But Patrick was really fond of her too. We did a lot of events together. She would either come over, or then during COVID, we did it by Zoom. But she was a complicated person with a complicated life, which I think made her a great writer. Anyway, Patrick, come and join us and see if there are any questions that anybody might wish to ask. You did like Ann Perry too, right?
I really liked her. We used to get into these philosophical conversations, and she was just a fascinating person.
He was. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, one of the questions that's come in from earlier in the talk was somebody wanted to know the name of the book on the East End that you reference, Will.
Oh yeah, it's called London's East End Point of Arrival.
Do you know the author by chance?
No, not
Okay.
by chance. No.
Okay.
Okay. And while we're doing that, I am going to make a recommendation that I did last night. It is Jay Roseanne's book. Let me see if I can find it here. I was put onto this. It's a Substack thing that you can sign up for. And Allison Epstein, who wrote a book called Fagin the Thief. I don't know if you've seen it, Will, but it's a wonderful kind of Dickensian mystery. It was a book we talked to her about in February. She writes a Substack thing called Dirtbags Through History. Well, I couldn't resist. I mean, who could resist reading Dirtbags Through History, right? So when I signed up, never having been on Substack, the next thing I know was that I heard from Substack, other people on it. And there is a really brilliant guy who is on Substack, and it's called Londonist Time Machine. And I cannot tell you how fascinating it is. It's not every day. His most recent one, he was writing about the lost palace of Bridewell that Henry VIII built in London, but he goes all over London in all different periods. You know, he's looking at the architecture, so whatever it all is, and it's completely fascinating. So let me see if I can once again say to people what this actually is. Londonist, Londonist, and you can find it on Substack. So if you're interested, there it is. Londonist : Time Machine. And you can subscribe to it, and then you can just geek out doing all this stuff. I'll send it to you, Will, while I'm thinking about it right now.
Excellent.
There's somebody
Great.
that's,
Carry on.
yeah, reading about the book and is interested in the crawlers, and makes a reference to I guess there's a riot in a women's shelter in your book.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Was that based on a historical incident or?
That was not, but they were reaching toward that situation. I have two female lawyers running it, and they were actually historical figures. In fact, they were a couple, and they just basically took care of the women that didn't have anything going for them at that point, and a lot of them were being beaten. I mean, there was no recourse, of any sort if you're in the East End and you've got an abusive husband or things like that, and or their children also being, endangered. So I knew that things were coming along, like the Salvation Army, who was going gung ho at that point. So I wanted to use a shelter that I had before in my books and turn it into a woman's shelter, and see what sort of hijinks everyone can get into there.
There's a great battle scene in it where the gates are barred, but it turns out there's a rear entry. I love that. I thought that was really very dramatic.
It's fun.
Yeah, the whole East End is so fascinating, as in the 20th century, how we get into the Cray brothers era, and
Yes.
all other villains, as they called them in the East End.
When you have a new book comes out, nonfiction, and it's like, this was Jack the Ripper, and this was Jack the Ripper, and this was Jack the Ripper, and you start looking at these books, you realize, here's a really bad guy. Wait, here's another really bad guy. Here's the third really bad guy, and you suddenly realize how many bad guys were in the East End at the time, and what sort of terrible things were going on. I mean,
But don't you think it was really like a jungle, I mean, I think it was very, very much like a jungle warfare to people trying to survive. And, ethics kind of go out the window when you're starving.
right. And ethics go out the window when you've got lots of money. You
Well,
are
that's
doing one thing or another.
I think that is one of the interesting aspects of this book, among many, is that you have really loads of money on one end and a person crawling along the streets of London on the other end.
Mhm. That's actually the thought that I had. And I came up with this thought maybe 5 or 6 years ago and never got down to writing it down until this book started. That, I mean, that you would start out with a character that was the weakest person, and by the time you got to the end of the book, they had caused so many changes, in people's lives.
Yeah.
What were the street drugs that were available at that time?
Well, the thing was, there was practically no laws against anything. There
Right.
was cocaine going on there, obviously everywhere you could possibly want it, and there was opium and everything you could imagine, from cough syrup for kids, to
Right.
full opium dens that were going on there. In my series, I have a guy who runs an opium den from China, because the English had sent opium to China, to trade for tea, and he was like doing the opposite. He was opening it up so that he could get so many English people addicted to his opium, as his way of getting back, at English society.
Yeah, the English took opium from Afghanistan and took it to China, and so they could trade it out for tea. They were, I have to say, truly ruthless businessmen. And
Yes, it
the
was.
British Empire was really not so much about territorial conquest as it was business. The British, I mean, think about it. They sent an expedition up, the Amazon to steal the rubber tree pods at Manaus. They sent Captain Bligh out to the Pacific to bring back the breadfruit tree.
Right.
Um, Nathaniel's nutmeg, which I mentioned before, Patrick, they wanted to get, I'm trying to remember, must have been nutmeg from a little tiny island, the only place in the world it grew in the East Indies. And they got the Dutch to swap New York for this little tiny island. And then they went to the island and dug up the trees and the soil, which was the key, and took it all back to Kew Gardens. I mean, that was their genius.
Mhm.
So the cartels maybe weren't so brutal after all. Or there's a precedent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean the East India Company, all of that. It's all about profits and business, and it's amazing.
Yeah, and that pervasiveness of the British class system, you know, is all throughout. Did you find, like, obviously your books have a social conscience, and you talk a lot about these different issues. Did you kind of develop that as you were researching? I'm sure it came naturally to you, but as you read more, did more of the inequality and injustice kind of strike you?
Yes, I became more of an advocate than I ever thought I would be. And also, I've had this thing from the very beginning that things that are happening now work their way into my books. So today I actually wrote the word tariff on a Barker Llewellyn novel that I'm working on. So I like to mirror the present because I always have this theory that, we are doomed to repeat and everything is on a cycle. And but
It's very true. One of the things that we are doomed to repeat is the fact that all bull markets end in a bust. And we were heading in that direction before the tariffs, and we're accelerating it, but it was going to happen,
and we're all thinking it's never going to happen. We're going to be just fine, and then
and we're
boom.
not. No. So which number is, I was just going to count. We're at 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. This is your 15th, is that right?
The 16th, I believe.
16. I'm missing one. Okay. So you said 20. So can
Mhm.
we feel assured that you're going to go for at least 4 more books?
Yes. Try to get going there.
Eat your veggies, Will.
Yeah.
Right. I love it. All right. Are there any other questions, Patrick?
Well, I've got to ask a little bit about, because people may not be aware of your martial arts training. Can you talk just a minute or so about that?
Well, I started when I was 13. I broke my arm, and my doctor recommended that I do something to strengthen it. And there was a karate class across the street, so I signed up for it. And I taught last Monday in my Tai Chi class. So I've been doing it ever since, all those years, over 50 years now, all different sorts of martial arts. And one thing I was happy about was that there was the martial art that supposedly Sherlock Holmes uh, was studying, and it was a real martial art, and it had completely died out. So I talked to a guy online, back when Yahoo was really popular, and we started corresponding, and he was a martial artist and was in England. So at that point, we started the idea of creating this manual. So we got the manual. Meanwhile, we started sending it out to various people, and now it's called Bartitsu, and there are schools all around the world, and it was all kind of more or less started because I wanted to use one move that was actually, really used, and it wasn't invented or from another different martial art, and that was a big surprise that it would get so popular. And all I was doing was talking to a guy on online.
So Barker is actually pretty good at all that.
Yes, yes. And pretty much everything I'm used in the books, I've actually used, myself in a class or something like that, or get it directly out of something and practice it. So it's not all made up, and it's not all clean and pretty. One of Barker's favorite things is to basically run somebody into a wall, one of these brick walls on the East End, and so anything can be a weapon. So
You bet. Right. That
Okay.
it?
I think that's about it.
Wonderful. Well, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. It's always nice to see Julia, your wife, the writer, who was on screen here before we started getting us all tuned in. So what's up with Julia?
Yeah, her new book, the Kennedy Girl, has just come out. It's basically, as we call it, a spy novel set in the 1960s in Paris, and it's a female centric. The spies are not male, and I love that concept. When she first floated it to me, I'm like, genius! Yes, write it.
So two writers living amicably in the same house. That's scary.
Right, and we both have blue covers this month. So.
All right. Well, I'll have to get a copy. I'm sorry, I should have had one I could hold up here at the same time. Anyway, well, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for signing books for us. Thank you for talking to us. And I will hope to do this again next year with your next book.
Right. Good to see you,
Or
Barbara.
come and see us, however it works out best for you.